When Samuel Chu fell asleep watching Law & Order this July, he wasn't expecting to wake up an international fugitive.
I'm the managing director for Hong Kong Democracy Council, and I also happen to be lucky enough to be the first U.S. citizen to be targeted under the national security law in Hong Kong a year ago.
Samuel dozed off in L.A. to the sound of New York's finest.
Hey, I'm asking you a question. What's the charge?
Oh, there's no charge. This one's on us.
Cracking cases and drinking coffee out of those fun blue cups.
And then I woke up because my phone kept vibrating and there were hundreds of messages. By the time I think it was 5 or 6 o'clock on Pacific time on the West Coast where I was. And I keep seeing these messages. People are going, "Are you okay? Are you safe?" And I was like, I have no idea what is happening. Until a reporter actually texted me and I actually called her back. And she's like, "Did you read the news yet?" And I said, "I have not." And she said, "You better hang up and read the news."
Hong Kong police are reportedly seeking the arrest of 6 pro-democracy activists who have fled.
Samuel is wanted for allegedly inciting secession and colluding with foreign powers.
Under the new law, these are very serious crimes. If found guilty, they could face up to life in prison. Now, CNN.
These kind of moves from the Chinese state, they're exactly why Samuel spends so much of his time pushing America to be tough on China and to hold that country accountable for its human rights abuses. From Xinjiang, where China is reportedly interning and abusing over 1 million Uyghur Muslims, to Hong Kong. Samuel and other human rights activists, they face real threats from Chinese autocracy. But Asian Americans like Samuel also face another threat: an explosion of racism at home.
Tonight, San Francisco police arresting a man for allegedly assaulting an Asian man because of his race.
Multiple people are dead after several shootings at massage parlors in Georgia Tuesday.
In Portland, more than a dozen Asian-owned businesses in recent weeks have been vandalized.
This is a terrible situation of a community that's been driven underground by fear of real attacks that are happening.
Today on Things That Go Boom, China's emerged as a central figure in the Biden administration's narrative fight for the middle class, and it remains a central figure in its current military competition. But does all of that tough on China talk lead to anti-Asian hate at home?
We're not looking for confrontation, although we know there will be steep competition.
And if it does, is there a better way for us to help with the fight for human rights that Samuel believes in?
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
Here's a word we heard a lot in 2020: heroes. Over and over again, nurses, doctors, and other healthcare workers all put their lives on the line during the COVID-19 pandemic, keeping the rest of us safe. But for Asian and Asian American workers who make up a huge chunk of the healthcare system, the hero label they got at work often didn't extend outside the hospital doors.
Someone shouted a racial slur across the street to me. It kind of caught me off guard because I was walking out of the hospital that day and I was clearly wearing hospital scrubs.
And healthcare workers were not the only ones. From the start of the pandemic to the end of last year, the group Stop AAPI Hate says they received more than 2,800 reports of racism and discrimination. It's actually gotten to the point that when organizer Nina Lowe's parents are going out of the house these days, she tells them to be careful.
I've asked my parents to stop wearing Chinese-looking clothing. I asked them to wear Nike and baseball caps and full sunglasses, masks, just to appear as nondescript and non-Asian as possible.
Of course, you might remember there was a lot of finger pointing at the start of the pandemic.
The Chinese virus.
It comes from China.
Kung flu.
But one of the reasons that finger pointing was so intense is because of another narrative that had been growing in Washington long before the pandemic hit.
Here in China, huge sums are being spent to modernize and improve the army. defense spending has been going up by double-digit percentages almost every year for 2 decades.
Over the last few years, China has aggressively built up artificial islands, extending its military capability far beyond its own borders.
For years, U.S. companies have accused China of stealing trade secrets to the loss of tens of billions of dollars.
One that says, when it comes to the future, China is the greatest threat we face.
China remains our biggest long-term challenge.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing.
2020 was a big year for that narrative. So big, in fact, that polls show the percentage of Americans who view China as our greatest enemy doubled from 22% to 45%. And so far, the Biden administration hasn't exactly pumped the brakes.
What I'd make China do is play by the international rules.
You know, China wasn't transparent enough. We have been saying that for a very long time, that China needed to provide more access to the lab. And we don't think that they have met that standard.
We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies.
Pandemics like these and public health crises like these, in particular moments where North American states play up geopolitical tensions with Asia, the first people to feel it, first and foremost, are Asian people, even as we have nothing to do with geopolitics back home.
That's Adrian DeLeon. He studies Asian American identity at USC. And Adrian says this kind of scapegoating, it's not new. You might have heard this story. In 1982, an auto parts draftsman named Vincent Chin was out celebrating the start of the rest of his life.
I think it was days before his wedding.
He was out with the boys for a small bachelor party, listening to music, having a few drinks at a strip club in Detroit, where middle-class manufacturing jobs had been hit hard with the rise of shiny new Japanese cars.
When really the decline of the American auto industry had started long before the introduction of Toyota and Honda.
That night, 2 white guys who worked in the auto industry saw him in the club, and they blamed him.
Notwithstanding the fact that Vincent Chin was Chinese, not Japanese.
Also notwithstanding the fact that no matter what Vincent's ethnicity was, his suburban life had nothing to do with negotiating high-level trade deals. But that kind of detail didn't matter.
Vincent was being a little rambunctious, obnoxious, because he was drunk. Come on, it's your bachelor party.
There was a confrontation in the club, and later that night, the 2 men tracked Vincent down at a nearby McDonald's and killed him.
Mr. Evans and Mr. Nitz jumped out from behind the truck. Mr. Evans was standing over him with a baseball bat, and he was hitting him in the top of his head.
He swung the bat as if a baseball player was swinging for a home run.
Adrian says that's just one example of the anti-Asian racism that is such a big part of American history.
We often start stories with the railroad and with the gold rush, right? 1849, the 49ers, and Chinese migrants meeting the sort of rivalries in the gold mines with, white settlers.
But he says to really understand the roots of this, you have to go back even further.
For me, it starts with imperialism. It starts with the multiple imperialisms of the enslavement of Africans, the theft of indigenous land, and also the imperialism of Britain, the United States, and France, and Germany in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, to force those places to sort of break open their markets for European and American interests. And so this is why migrants came. Migrants, people who can't afford to live in Qing Dynasty China anymore, found ways to get themselves over to somewhere like the United States. This sort of tells us in larger scope the story of coolie labor on the plantations, Chinese railroad workers as part of that longer history.
And American imperialism was a big part of that history.
In a lot of ways, modern America is founded on anti-Asian violence. It begins with empire and continues with empire. And I say empire because the United States knew itself as an empire until it started denying it because it looked bad as an empire when it had to justify itself against its history against Britain, its history against Japan or China.
When you look at a map of the mainland U.S., it's easy to forget that this country is, right now, an Asia-Pacific power. Along with the state of Hawaii and our many military bases, there are Pacific Ocean territories that we slap our flag on today. Places like American Samoa, the Mariana Islands.
That's sort of as a way to like temper the exceptionalism behind, oh my gosh, like this is such an exceptional, unprecedented moment. It's not. It's actually built into the longer history of U.S. imperialism from 1898, the Spanish-American War, taking over the Philippines and Hawaii and Guam and Puerto Rico, to the Second World War against Japan.
9 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan bombed us again. This time, targeting the Philippines, which the U.S. only granted independence in 1946.
We're here because you were over there first. Having been born and spent my childhood in the Philippines, the United States is all over the place. We're always sort of paying attention to what's going on in the United States as the rest of the world is, to think about, okay, what's happening next? How do we respond?
So how should that reality inform our relationship with China today? Well, there may not be one right answer. Remember our democracy activist, Samuel Chu?
We are having a reckoning to our racism as a country. And yes, irresponsible, nationalistic, white supremacy way of talking about China does contribute, will contribute, and has contributed to more violence and hate. But that is not the genesis. And that
for him,
should not give us
this kind of long history is exactly why Americans who blame the spike in anti-Asian hate on DC's criticism of China aren't seeing the bigger picture.
I think it's disingenuous and lazy to just say holding China accountable for its human rights violation and this competition that is emerging is responsible for that racism and that hate.
But for Adrian, once you bring our economic and military approach into the equation, racism on the ground and DC rhetoric look much more intimately connected. The Biden administration, as you rightly point out, has been using a lot of rhetoric lately about being tough on China, especially from a military perspective. Yeah. And then on the flip side, you have the Biden administration talking a lot about fighting anti-Asian hate. Is it possible for them to do both?
No.
Okay. Coming up, what does Washington get from this competition? And what does it mean for people caught in the middle? That's after the break. There's a thought process behind the White House's approach to Asia right now that's kind of defined like this. 1, limit or constrain China's power by strengthening alliances with other Asian countries and societies. And 2, so that we don't need China as much economically, build ourselves up at home. That's where a big part of Joe Biden's foreign policy for the middle class comes in. The concept of breaking down the divide between what we do out there and what we do over here. But the problem is when this starts being used as a threat. When the fear of a foreign, invasive other becomes the reason to get ambitious projects passed domestically.
China and other countries are closing in fast. China is out investing us by a long shot. It will grow the economy, make us more competitive around the world, promote our national security interest, and put us in a position to win the global competition with China.
Just one example, the American Jobs Plan, something that Adrian DeLeon, our USC professor, has been studying closely.
The first paragraph in the fact sheet on the whitehouse.gov of the American Jobs Plan, he says, the American Jobs Plan is an investment in America that will create millions of good jobs, rebuild our country's infrastructure, and, get this, position the United States to outcompete China.
Even the White House's language about investing at home, it has this specter looming in the background.
The American Jobs Plan will invest in America in a way we have not invested since we built the interstate highways and won the space race. Here's the thing. The interstate highway system and the space race was also a time of geopolitical rivalry against China and against Russia. It was the Cold War.
So that's one thing that the Biden administration gets out of anti-China rhetoric. It makes things easier. In other words, if you don't say yes to new Amtrak funding, you're saying yes to the end of the free world.
Infrastructure is not just about let's build better railroads or something like that, right? But actually becomes a way through which the country thinks about itself.
This language might help us secure some wins in the short term, but it also adds to the tension we have with another global superpower. Think of it this way. If the U.S. were a TikTok meme right now, we'd be this one.
Is it me? Am I the drama? I don't think I'm the drama.
It'll be tough to bring this kind of drama down to a simmer, especially since the U.S. has been investing more heavily in this competition since 2011. That's when Obama started what he called the pivot to Asia.
The United States is a Pacific power, and we are here to stay.
When you talk to people who were serving in the military at the time, they talk about how, the conversation sort of switched from the Middle East to the Asia Pacific overnight, and all of a sudden that's what people were obsessed with.
That's Nina Lo, again. She's an organizer who focuses on things like decarceration and Asian American issues. But she's also been thinking a lot lately about how diaspora communities like hers are affected by what we do abroad.
It's not like if no violence happens in the U.S., then people here aren't impacted. Like our family members, our loved ones.
Nina says the pivot to Asia was a major shift since, among other things, it transferred almost 2/3 of American air naval forces to the Asia Pacific.
So right now, the U.S. has 800 overseas military bases. About half of them, or 400, are encircling China. The U.S. spends a ton of money on defense. We know this. It's more than the next 10 nations combined, including China. And the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has stationed 130,000 plus troops in the region, conducting nearly daily exercises, including with their allies, and doing island hopping around the Asia Pacific. So all in all, it's really military brinkmanship designed to show that the U.S. is adopting, as they say, like a forward posture where they're ready to confront any kind of aggression at any time. In itself is actually an act of aggression.
China's been arming up too, growing its defense budget slowly, modernizing its military hardware, and grabbing effective control of the South China Sea. Nina says a militarized approach is the wrong reaction.
I think what's so important in these discussions around national security is just to remember how twisted that conversation can make our conception of safety. The world is not safer when everybody has more nuclear weapons. The world is not safer when every nation is more militarized. But if you constantly work in a world where your automatic assumption is that everyone wants to invade or kill, then your automatic response is going to be to arm up. And so that's what we see happening right now.
And experts say this isn't likely to change anytime soon. Ray Zhong with the Wilson Center says dueling interests are just pushing both the U.S. and China toward more competition.
It feels kind of like a game of chicken in that they're just sort of heading towards each other. Neither seems to be really peeling away and really considering the secondary consequences of more aggressive diplomatic language and diplomatic moves.
There are other factors pushing us into this competition, too. For example, we can't forget that we have allies in Asia looking to us for support with their own foreign policy goals. And they're hoping for some long overdue consistency.
Alliance building and rebuilding is probably the biggest diplomatic branch that the Biden administration is trying to establish after kind of inconsistent policymaking during the Trump years. There were a lot of instances where, for instance, the North Korea negotiations where traditional allies like South Korea have felt like haven't received a lot of clear messaging from the U.S. State Department.
So our allies are expecting us to show up, be more present in the Asia Pacific. And at home, we're feeling economic insecurities, a worry that we're going to lose our place in the market. And finally, there's this worry that China isn't playing by the rules that we're used to. These are all factors that are leading to escalating tension. But Biden doesn't have to just ratchet up our military presence. And he doesn't have to stop holding China's feet to the fire on human rights. Recently, a number of progressive groups wrote a letter calling on the Biden administration and Congress to cool off on their aggressive stance toward China, including over human rights, saying those criticisms could make it harder to work with China on climate change. Samuel says that's a silly way to think.
China continued and participated in, for example, the Paris Accord when the U.S. actually pulled out of it. One way I look at it is that, is China really going to accelerate its global warming action just to spite the U.S. or me for calling them out on Hong Kong and Xinjiang? I mean, is that how we think that their action is rooted in and what they're going to do?
We need to recognize that we're talking about a country with its own politics, a country we can criticize and also work with.
We can actually walk and chew gum at the same time.
So where do we go from here? How do we engage with our allies over their concerns without contributing to hate here at home? Well, there are a few different ideas. First, Samuel says America's foreign policy needs to platform people in his shoes.
Those people like me and like the Uyghurs activists who are here in the U.S. who are actually at the convergence of these two things. We need to be lifted up that we can do these two things, that these two things are both true, that we have to fight against CCP repressive authoritarian regime, and we have to recognize the role that AAPI and Chinese American plays in American history and society.
If we could find a way to make clear to people that so many Asians and Asian Americans are some of the most invested in stopping Chinese autocracy, maybe that will counter some of this barrage of anti-Asian racism here. And speaking of anti-Asian racism, it wouldn't hurt for DC to start thinking about employment equity. Ray says it's time to reconsider who we listen to in Washington when we talk about China.
Well, a lot of it starts within the policy spaces. This field effectively relies a lot on young Chinese people's labor.
Ray says that while white experts get a lot of the credit, they depend on the intellectual work of others behind the scenes. Hopefully, listening directly to the voices of Chinese scholars will lead to some more nuanced views on what the country wants and how we can work with it.
It's time to really recognize how the research and analysis is being done. It's a reckoning that's been a long time coming.
But for Adrian, there's a historical reckoning that America also needs.
The concept of China in the United States has specifically been and continues to be deployed in anti-Asian ways and xenophobic ways, in ways that stoke up racial fears and tensions about an invading rival power from the East and threatening the supremacy of the West.
America brings so much baggage to any conversation we have about Asia, and Biden has to understand that's not going away. Yes, Biden has focused on competing with the Chinese state, not on demonizing the country's people. But to Adrian, that distinction seems disingenuous, especially when you look at how Biden approaches Asians and Pacific Islanders here. He pointed out that just this spring, the U.S. deported about 30 Vietnamese refugees.
And so when he says, let's be tough on China, and still says, let's combat anti-Asian hate, what he actually means, and what I think the administration means, is American first that happens to be Asian. The sort of recourse is, yes, let's protect our own Asians. And to me, that is infinitely disturbing because it shows not just an apathy, but an antipathy towards Asian and other marginalized and global South people all over the world, as well as in the United States.
And this is where we come back to this foreign policy for the middle class. Because as committed as Samuel may be to Hong Kong's freedom, he also sees how pressure against his adversary is being used for easy points here at home.
Instead of just talking about, China stealing stuff from us, let's also talk about how we're stealing stuff from ourselves. We're shortchanging our own investment in education and research and technology, and that's what we're trying to get the Congress to do, to legislate, not just to score political points.
That's something Nina wants to see too.
I wish the Biden administration would sell a bold, progressive infrastructure proposal and other policy issues without having to drum up a big China threat that is racist and xenophobic and will lead to more military spending and more violence abroad.
Maybe we don't need to pit Amtrak funding against the end of the free world. Maybe instead, it's time for the Biden administration to get us all aboard. Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by Katie Toth and me, and edited by Ruth Morris, Layla Ujali, Emily Vaughn, and Jason Saldana. Darian Schulman writes the music for our show, and Robin Wise pulls the train into the station. Thank you, as always, to the foundations that make our work possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Publishers Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. Thanks, as always, for listening and supporting our show. If you'd like to do more to support us, leave us a review. Those things are huge. And come on over and visit us on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you right back here in 2 weeks. All aboard?